Hello everybody, welcome to Left on Right, where we give the left-wing perspective on right-wing media. Today we are talking about Ben Shapiro's take on the federal funding freeze at Harvard. Ben Shapiro makes a lot of logical arguments and is a potent debater, so I respect that and I've enjoyed reviewing his video. I had to think a lot about how to properly contextualize this discussion, and I also seek to steelman Ben Shapiro's arguments. The two most important threads underlying this debate are as follows. The right views elite academic institutions like Harvard as indoctrinating people into left-wing views, and also these institutions do not allow right-wing ideas to be discussed freely. So this is an interesting point, and to some degree, I agree there is an issue here. This is a big thing that Ben Shapiro points out, and I think the key is there's a lot of beliefs that are widely held across the country, which would be considered racist. And so, regardless of the validity of those points or not, a lot of people believe it, so a key component of education would be allowing free discussion of those topics. And this would depend a lot on the particular institution, but I do, from my personal experience, think that it would be hard to discuss certain topics that are discussed on Ben Shapiro's channel, for instance. So point number two, a very important thread underlying this debate, is that the Trump administration is exploiting the Israel-Palestine conflict to expand their power. So what do I mean by that exactly? People are going to get accustomed to the idea of the federal government using power in a way that's unsubstantiated, disproportionate, and unconstitutional. So what does that mean in this context? Unsubstantiated. So all of Trump's demands on Harvard University don't have a strong evidentiary basis. There were some lawsuits against Harvard that were settled, and a number of improvements were implemented at Harvard. So the Trump administration comes in, freezes all this funding, and they don't have a strong legal basis to do this. Next point is disproportionate. So the funding that's getting frozen is essentially federal research grants that the federal government gives money to Harvard to do research into various topics that are important for our country. And so those are getting frozen based on a separate issue that is getting addressed currently. So it's a disproportionate use of power. And then the third point is that the demands of the Trump administration are unconstitutional. So it's good to take a look at those actual demands. So I just highlighted a few points here. So prevent admitting students hostile to American values and institutions inscribed in the U.S. Constitution, including students supportive of terrorism or anti-Semitism. Here's the thing. Who gets to determine what is terrorism or anti-Semitism? This is deeply unconstitutional, as whoever gets to decide what is terrorism or anti-Semitism would then be able to prevent students from coming to Harvard. And there's legitimate debate over the Israel-Palestine conflict. Point number two, which is also unconstitutional, is that the university shall commission an external party to audit the student body, faculty, staff, and leadership for viewpoint diversity. So who determines what that viewpoint diversity means and what types of diversity are there? This is, again, the federal government coming in to audit everybody's viewpoints at an academic institution, which is also deeply unconstitutional. Now, I will say for the Trump administration, they're being extremely strategic at exploiting the Israel-Palestine conflict. So if you look at all these things, they're all things that on the face of it are somewhat reasonable, but then they are being disproportionate in their demands and also asking to essentially go over all of the beliefs of the people at the university, have those reported to the federal government, and getting rid of people as necessary. All right, with all that context, let's go back into the video. So we've got Ben Shapiro here talking about how Trump smashes Harvard. Good title.
Couple of days that the United States government has now frozen billions of dollars in funding to Harvard. The reason for this is because Harvard refuses to go along with the federal government's demands that it abide by the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So
this is already begging the question. So nobody has demonstrated that Harvard has not complied with the Civil Rights Act of 1967. So when Ben Shapiro phrases it this way, he's assuming that it's already been demonstrated, which really isn't the case. There's been lawsuits about this, and they've been settled, and improvements have been implemented at Harvard. Of course, there could be room for more improvements, but the fact that Harvard's way out of line in terms of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is a huge stretch and isn't well supported in the legal sense.
The Civil Rights Act dictates that universities and any business that actually receives federal funding must abide by anti-discrimination law. Now, you cannot like some aspects of the Civil Rights Act, its attempts to intrude into the private sphere, for example. But the Civil Rights Act is in fact the Civil Rights Act. And the fact is that if a university had facilitated anti-black racism to the extent that Harvard University has facilitated anti-Semitism.
So that is highly debatable, the extent to which the Harvard administration has facilitated anti-Semitism. So I think when we step back a little bit here, one of the core components of this is the Israel-Palestine conflict and what constitutes appropriate debate there. So I spent a lot of time learning about that. That's a huge topic that is beyond the scope of this video, but I think the thing I'd like to say is that it's a very important issue that necessitates a robust debate, and trying to have the federal government shut that down is not the right way to approach that debate. There are definitely instances of people on the Harvard campus who overstep their bounds, and they have been reined in. So I think Ben Shapiro's take on this is very excessive. All right, let's continue.
There's no question that removal of its federal funding would be on the table. Now, we can also be real about the politics of the situation, which is that federal funding should not be going to these universities anyway.
So I totally disagree with that. So Ben Shapiro's misrepresenting what the federal funds are going to. So let's go into what he's talking about here, which basically supports my point.
So how much money does Harvard actually get from the federal government? I asked our sponsors over at Perplexity exactly how much money does Harvard University receive on an annualized basis from the federal government. They said Harvard University.
So it's kind of weird to use Perplexity because it's a large language model that looks at a bunch of different pieces of evidence, and it can get numbers wrong. So we actually need to check those sources, but let's continue. It doesn't necessarily change his argument too much, but using Perplexity without looking at the sources isn't a very good way to do research.
Receives substantial funding from the federal government each year, primarily to support its research activities. In fiscal year 2024, Harvard received approximately $686 million from federal agency. This amount constituted about 68% of the university's total sponsored research revenue.
Okay, there's the key point, which is sponsored research revenue. So the whole point of this federal funding is for the U.S. government wants to put money to do research certain things, so they contract that out with universities. That money is separate from the funding that would fund students' tuitions and so on.
Accounted for roughly 11% of its overall operating revenue, which is a lot of money. I mean, that's a lot of money that they are receiving. Most of it goes to various science.
Various science. Great.
Outlets like Harvard Medical School or the School of Public Health, but it also does go to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences.
Faculty of Arts and Sciences. That doesn't sound that bad to me.
The Department of Health and Human Services, the largest federal funding they provide.
Health and Human Services, also something very valuable to our country.
$520 million in fiscal year 2024. Now, again, this is a lever. It's not as though all of this money is going into the pockets of the English professors at Harvard.
Yeah, I agree with Ben Shapiro there.
But money is also fungible. So money that would have been spent on the medical facility is now being spent instead on the English faculty. And this is sort of the point the Trump administration is making.
This is a big stretch. Money is earmarked for particular things. I mean, there's like 50 or there's hundreds of different sub-funds that the endowment goes to, which has restricted use for their money. So it's not like the money can just go anywhere.
There's no reason at all that your federal taxpayer dollars should be going to Harvard University, which has a massive endowment, billions and billions of dollars in its endowment, $53 billion at last count. There's no.
So I was saying I was going to steel man Ben Shapiro. I'm not sure why he's making this argument. Just because the Harvard endowment has a lot of money doesn't mean that doesn't make sense to fund research into important issues at Harvard. So I'm not really sure why he's making that argument. I think this just comes down to the fact that the Republicans like to paint the elite universities as the enemy, but this really doesn't make a lot of sense. One of Trump's big pillars is improving the economy, bringing back manufacturing. Where are the entrepreneurs and the engineers and the scientists going to come from to build those factories? They're going to come from our academic institutions. So hamstringing our academic institutions by cutting funding and increasing uncertainty for international students is not the way to achieve one of Trump's main priorities, which is bring back manufacturing to our country.
Reason your taxpayer dollars should be going to fund Harvard in the first place. And maybe that's the overall fight that we actually should be having. But that's a fight that has to be had in Congress as opposed to inside the executive branch. The executive branch is now making the claim that Harvard University should have its funding removed because it is in violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1965.
That hasn't been demonstrated that Harvard's in violation of the Civil Rights Act.
Harvard, for its part, says it is now going to resist the Trump administration's demands to change its governance structure over campus anti-Semitism concerns. And so the government then responded by announcing a $2.26 billion freeze of Harvard's multi-year grants and contracts. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. Harvard President Alan Garber put out a statement complaining about the federal government and suggesting the federal government was wrong for involving itself in this way. How dare the federal government actually attach strings to the things it has always attached strings to? Harvard President Alan Garber said the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. The Trump administration said the school is responsible.
So I think Ben Shapiro doesn't really steel man the opposition there. So the constitutional rights that are at risk are very clear from the letter from the Trump administration. Basically, there's going to be they're trying to say that we're going to have all this scrutiny over what views students have and what views the faculties have and so on. And that's clearly hugely unconstitutional.
Quote, reinforces the troubling entitlement mindset that is endemic in our nation's most prestigious universities and colleges.
Entitlement mindset's not a fair way to characterize this. I think every American should feel entitled to free speech, and having the federal government come in and dictate what you can and can't do research on and what views you can have is totally ridiculous.
Federal investment does not come with the responsibility to uphold civil rights laws. What exactly are the demands? Well, they asked for 9 actions. Most of the demands concerned how the university operates. The government was asking for a comprehensive mask ban, as well as changes to governance, leadership, and admissions, and an end to diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI programs. So DEI programs are in violation of the Civil Rights Act. There's no question.
There's actually a lot of questions about this. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea of we need to revisit DEI in some ways, but a lot of DEI just comes down to the fact that you want to have a institution be welcoming for lots of different people. I've done a fair amount of work in this area. It's really obvious if you look at it how certain environments, like let's say a department's 90% men, and the 10% of women are going to feel uncomfortable in various ways. And so it's just a nice thing to do to try and pay attention to the ways those 10% of women would feel ostracized within the departments and make it better. So the idea that DEI is this really terrible thing is not fair, and Ben Shapiro basically just takes for granted that DEI is bad, but I think it's fair to push back on that. I think there has been the question of admissions and like what preference you give to diversity is an interesting one, and I think there's a good debate to be had there. So I think the right wing does have some points as to like, you say there's some unfairness in society, so like how does that actually concretely manifest itself in terms of admissions, which ideally you'd like those to be completely fair, and it's a hard question to answer. So I think there's a legitimate discussion there, but the idea that all DI programs are bad and unconstitutional is just a huge stretch.
The DEI, which is predicated on the false notion that inequality of outcome by group must be due to discrimination and therefore must be rectified by reverse discrimination, that is in violation of the Civil Rights Act. It's certainly in violation of Supreme Court standards with regard to affirmative action.
So he's taking on a very narrow view of what DEI is. So I'm going to move on a little bit here. So let's go back to Harvard's response and what he has to say about it.
University political views and policy preferences advanced by the Trump administration and commit the university to punishing disfavored speech. Well, no, actually, they're just saying that if you engage in anti-Semitism, then that is in.
Well, the thing is, who determines what constitutes engaging in anti-Semitism? This is actually a really critical point here. Who decides what's terrorism or anti-Semitism, and therefore their speech can be restricted, is a really critical question. Do you want the federal government determining that? The federal government can just go and call someone a terrorist and, imprison them, and you don't want the federal government to be able to, especially the executive branch, to be able to do that unilaterally. There needs to be an evidentiary procedure that determines things like that through the judicial branch.
Violation of the Civil Rights Act. It's funny to watch all these universities that for years were willing to expel students for saying that boys were not girls, that went after Harvard University. I was there when they went after Lawrence Summers, who was, at the time was the president of Harvard University. They got angry at him because he made the mere suggestion that perhaps the lack of women in scientific institutions might be due to the fact that women are less interested in scientific pursuits overall as opposed to men, and also that the ends of the bell curve with regard to scientific performance on tests tend to be heavily male. He was ousted from his position for that.
So I think, this is one of Ben Shapiro's stronger points. Things like this, even if they're unpleasant to talk about, an academic institution, one of its core functions is the pursuit of truth. And so these types of things should be debated, and you shouldn't just get kicked out of the university for suggesting stuff like this. So I think that is a fair point by Ben Shapiro, and there is a major issue there with regards to free speech.
So don't give me your free speech concerns when you guys have been cracking down on free speech yourselves for a long time.
So, he makes a strong point about the free speech, but the solution to someone being a little bit inconsistent over free speech is to ensure that there's more free speech, not to crack down on free speech based on that inconsistency. This is also a weird false dichotomy where he says, well, in the past, Harvard was a bit inconsistent about its free speech, so we should crack down on free speech related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so this really just doesn't make a lot of sense.
At the very least, if you want to say that free speech doesn't apply, they're a private university, all right, then you have to be a private university. You can't have it both ways. You can't say free speech applies to us. We are a free speech institution. Also, we want your taxpayer money. That's not the way that it works. At least it shouldn't work.
So I basically disagree with his characterization that that's what's happening. I think that it's totally fair for the Harvard to continue navigating how to handle the free speech concerns of the people who are Jewish and also the people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians. All right, so that is the discussion of this video. I thought, Ben Shapiro is a real smart guy. He makes a lot of arguments. I think that the Trump administration has been extremely strategic in their desire to expand power here. So if you look at all their demands, they're all using language that sounds pretty reasonable. But then if you look into the details, there's all this ideological testing that is going to be audited by the federal government, which is clearly unconstitutional. And as I was saying earlier, there's a big power grab happening by the Trump administration. And that's basically, they're just exercising disproportionate power to get people to bend to their will. And the way in which this expands their power is that they're making people used to the idea that the federal government can just do these things and that's normal and okay. So I really hope that everybody here listening to this video, people who are fans of Ben Shapiro, got something out of it. And I think that we can all agree we don't want to have the federal government have too much power. So hopefully we can get to a better place on this, and also universities can debate more hotly contested topics without government interference. And people can not get ridiculous blowback for bringing up things that might be hotly contested. So thank you very much for listening to Left on Right, and I will see you in the next video.